Here's the sorting exercise running under everything today. Which of these AI announcements are actual objects and which are just press releases dressed up as objects? On Friday, 3 companies on 3 different continents poured real money into steel, turbines, and memory chips. The next day, a Guardian investigation found something odd. That £30 billion British project that OpenAI keeps touting, it's mostly a number that somebody made up. And the day gets stranger from there. A coding tool banned for spying, a jobs report that finally sees what forecasters predicted, and a safety watchdog admitting its own ruler reads short. Come with me, and by the close, you'll see what people are building, what people are faking, and what refuses to stay walled. Let's get into it. Start with the real stuff. On Friday, July 3rd, 3 companies committed hard money to the physical guts of the AI era, all in a single day. First, there's SK Telecom. The South Korean carrier committed 140 trillion won, which is about $91.5 billion, to a 1.5 gigawatt AI data center campus. It's part of a national buildout targeting 15 gigawatts. To fill that campus takes something like 3 million GPUs and millions of high bandwidth memory stacks. Those are the stacked memory chips that sit right next to the AI accelerators, and they're already one of the tightest bottlenecks in the whole supply chain. Second, you've got National Grid Ventures. That is the commercial arm of National Grid, which is a big transmission utility. It put $1.75 billion in for a 35% stake in a project called Kilby, run by a developer named Julent. Kilby is a 2.67 gigawatt gas plant in West Texas, locked to a 20-year power contract built to feed a single 2 gigawatt Microsoft data center. So let's look closely at that move for a second. A wires company is buying a piece of a power plant dedicated to just one customer's AI. That is a utility crossing into generation because the load itself is worth it. Third, NTT Facilities. NTT unveiled something it calls the Hyper-Ready Module. These are prefab, factory-built data center pieces that it says cut hyperscale construction time in half. So different continents there, different balance sheets, one shared fact. The substrate is getting poured and wired and energized right now. This one day shows 3 different examples of that happening in 3 different places and on 3 different parts of the chain. This is the part of an infrastructure era where the thing stops being a slide deck and shows up as actual turbines and steel and concrete. Now here's the part that cuts against the race for lasting advantage over everybody else story. NTT didn't keep its build time method secret. It handed rivals a technique that halves everyone's build time. So one of the 3 players that we just talked about gave away the thing that would make its own head start durable. So the scarcity that makes any single position permanent is already draining out of the room. And we're seeing that over and over again. More and more institutions are choosing to lift the floor for everyone, which I think, as I've said before, is the way of the future. And then there's one input that all 3 treat as the thing that actually decides the game. Bigger than the money, bigger than the chips, and that is the grid connection. That is the physical prerequisite, and the grid is publicly held infrastructure. The people who own it and regulate it can price it and steer it, which means one of the fastest buildouts in history has its binding constraint sitting in public hands, yours and mine. Hold on to that because the next story is what happens when a project skips it. So let's shift over to the counter image of that first story. This is a project that has the announcement, but not the physical object. A Guardian investigation published yesterday took apart OpenAI's Stargate UK. Stargate is OpenAI's brand for giant data center commitments. OpenAI rolled out the British version as a £30 billion shared vision with the UK government. Big headline, real flags, government handshake. And then the Guardian actually checked the number. Roughly £20 billion of that £30 billion commitment wasn't actually committed capital at all. It was simply an estimate of the amount needed, not money in the bank, money that someone figured the thing might cost. So about 2/3 of the flagship figure was only hypothetical. And the anchor site tells the same story. The project named Cobalt Park near Newcastle in northern England is its home. And the Guardian found that OpenAI appears to have never even visited it, not once. The site still has no grid connection. So let's stop right there. That's the exact input that the 3 real projects we just talked about all treated as decisive. A gas plant on a 20-year contract, a campus needing 3 million GPUs. Those are watts. moving. But a named site with no grid connection, obviously that's not a build-out, that's a plan wearing the costume of groundbreaking. A power contract and a press release are different kinds of objects, and only one of them actually moves the electrons. Now, there is one thing worth crediting on the British side. The same country isn't uniformly just starry-eyed here and ignorant. Its AI Safety Institute has been unusually candid that the rulebook cannot keep up with what these systems do, and that honesty is real, even as this flagship project's numbers melt under a reporter's questions. And we'll come back to that candor in today's fifth story. Now over to a wall going up around a tool that behaves like water finding its level. This is the second time that we've been here with Alibaba and Anthropic in just 2 weeks. Alibaba told its employees that they can no longer use Anthropic's Claude Code. Starting on July 10th, Alibaba classifies it as high risk and points engineers to its in-house tool, Coder. The trigger is Anthropic confirmed that back in March, one build of Claude Code contained an experiment that could detect when someone ran the tool from inside China. So those are two framings, and both are claims from parties protecting something. Alibaba calls it a backdoor risk. Anthropic describes it as a geographic usage experiment tied to its access rules. They say it's a way to spot unauthorized resellers and block distillation, which is where someone trains a cheaper model on a stronger one's output. Neither side is really a neutral narrator here, and there are really no heroes here either. And there are places, of course, where the friction is really obviously genuine and not just manufactured by framings. A coding assistant that can tell what country you are in from the inside erodes trust between labs and the developers who use their tools. Alibaba's caution is rational, so let's name that plainly, but if you zoom out to what the wall is actually walling, back in the June 26th edition, we covered Alibaba's own Quen team. They learned from roughly 28.8 million Claude exchanges routed through fraudulent accounts. So let's think about the sequence here. 1 week, the capability flows one direction through the wall, 28.8 million conversations worth. The next week, a wall goes up to stop the flow the other way. The wall and the leak are the same story told twice. And here's the thing about that wall. It doesn't touch the current going underneath it. A band just changes what assistant an engineer opens tomorrow morning instead. The capability itself will continue to distill into smaller systems, generalize across tasks, and pop back up in open weights within months of any frontier demonstration, as we have seen over and over. We watched Chinese open weight models reach broad enterprise adoption doing exactly this. So let's step back and ask what these walls are really defending. The advantage that they're protecting is one that is already dissolving on its own. And in the grand scheme, the reasons for the wall start to look small, insignificant, and frankly petty. Whose company, whose flag, whose reseller policy. None of it weighs much against what's actually on the table here. The gains from building this frontier together out in the open dwarf whatever edge anyone thinks that isolation buys. Every wall builder in this story is already drinking from the shared well, and they just don't want to admit it. That's not naive. That's just reading the current. All right, let's move over to work and a number that crossed a threshold in measurement. For months, forecasters have warned that AI would slow hiring, but in June, it finally showed up in the government's own monthly jobs report. The June report, released July 2nd, added just 57,000 jobs, about half what forecasters expected. And the softness clustered in two sectors mainly, finance and information. Those are the two furthest along in adopting AI, and they actually just shed jobs. Together, they'd given up around 150,000 positions so far just this year. That's nearly 25,000 jobs a month. Headline unemployment held at 4.2% though, but let's look at why it held. Part of that stability came from people leaving the labor force entirely. They're not finding work, they're just no longer counted as looking for it. And this is the new part. The forecasts already existed. Yesterday's 2-minute TCR headlines flagged Goldman's projection of 15 million displaced U.S. workers over time. What changed in June is that the pattern those forecasts described finally surfaced in the official tape. The Bureau of Labor Statistics' own count not as a think tank's model. Now, before this tips over into doom, look at the other half of the ledger, because it complicates the picture in a very good way. An analysis of 2.85 million active job listings found demand concentrating, not collapsing. More than 40,000 open roles each for software engineers, data engineers, and DevOps specialists. Fluency in Copilot, Cursor, and Claude named in over 60,000 positions. The work is moving toward people who can direct these AI systems. Now here's the genuinely hard part, and I won't soften it. Goldman flagged new graduates as facing the sharpest near-term exposure. The entry-level tasks that used to teach a junior worker the trade, those are the ones that are automating first. So the bottom rungs of the ladder are getting pulled up right as people reach for them. And that's real, and it lands on a specific group of people who did everything that they were told to do. And there's a measurement problem underneath all of it. A New York Times analysis on June 2nd laid it out. We built our labor statistics to count jobs gained and lost. We never built them to see a role rewritten around a new collaborator, which is what we've got now. When finance, for example, sheds headcount, but the output continues to climb, then the instruments registering the loss are showing that a deeper need is there, and that need is reorganization. And that points to what is actually happening to the word job. It's coming loose from its old industrial meaning, a fixed bundle of tasks traded for wages, and it's reattaching itself instead to something closer to a standing capacity to point capability at a problem. The demand for that capacity is already here. You can read it in the 60,000 job postings I just mentioned, but what we still have to build is the on-ramp. Now, there's more on this in today's Century Report, including the piece on the graduates who are walking into it first. But let's shift to the last story for today. 3 institutions admitted in one single week that they can't quite see what they're supposed to govern. So let's read this as candor, not failure. First, at a gathering in Frankfurt in early July, senior European bankers and supervisors said something really plainly, that AI is moving faster than the rules meant to govern it. Yeah, we kind of knew that, right? The old cycle of consult, draft, and enforce just doesn't fit the pace. The head of UK's Financial Conduct Authority said that traditional rulemaking cycles just don't work for agentic AI, and it's about time they admitted that publicly. The European Central Bank's Christine Lagarde called it a major risk. Second, we've got the FDA. In a July 2nd interview, the agency's AI lead explained why it's moving deliberately on guidance for drug development. And a former FDA AI lead, Tala Fakuri, said industry is actually misreading the agency's caution. They're reading a stop sign where there's actually a yield sign. And here's a third one, this is the third story that really stopped me. The UK's AI Safety Institute published a study of its own testing methods, and it found that its own agent evaluations systematically understate what a model can do. Now, why is that? Because you give a system more compute at test time, let it think longer, run more steps, and its performance keeps climbing past the ceiling a single-shot test records. That means their fixed budget single-shot tests were measuring low. Take that in for a moment. A safety body voluntarily published evidence that AI is more capable than its own official yardsticks suggest. That is the opposite of the normal institutional reflex. Institutions almost always defend how good their instruments are. This one, though, I think widened the confidence interval on its own reassurances. Let's credit that cleanly. This is rare and it's honest, and it should be celebrated. Now let's keep it honest in both directions, though. This is the same UK government that amplified OpenAI's phantom £30 billion Stargate number from story number 2 today. Self-scrutiny on its own evaluations and boosterism on its headlines live in the same government at once. Both those things are true. And this connects straight to the July 3rd edition, to 2 days ago. The UN's Independent Scientific Panel on AI cited a study finding the length of tasks leading systems can complete doubling every 4 to 7 months, faster than any governance or even science really can track. So here's the shift underneath all 3 of these admissions. The old model assumed a stable target. Write a rule, the world holds still, and the rule eventually fits. Continuous capability gain breaks that at the root. A consultation cycle measured in years closes on a world that no longer exists by the time it opens. What replaces it then is a live instrument recalibrated against capability as it moves, honest about its own error bars. That is not governance failing, that is governance learning to run. Let's bring it together. Today was one long exercise in telling claims from facts and things actually built. A power contract and a press release sat side by side, and only one of them actually moved the electrons. Two different framings of a coding tool ban competed for the top story, and neither one changed the current diffusing underneath the wall. And three regulators in the same week stood up and named the gap between what they claim to know and what they can actually verify. That sorting reveals three different limits. You can't conjure capability at this scale without a communique of some kind. You can't wall it inside just one country, and you can't fully measure it with a ruler built for a slower world. It arrives as watts, it seeps through walls, it outruns your yardsticks. On Friday, one continent committed $91.5 billion of it to actual concrete. On another, 20 billion pounds of it evaporated under a reporter's questions. And the difference between those two came down to whether anyone actually poured a foundation. So when you set today down, notice what is genuinely getting built. Real campuses rising on public grids that the public can actually still steer. A frontier that keeps leaking past every fence that somebody erects around it. Instruments finally honest enough to admit the thing that they measure is far bigger than they thought. The world doesn't get more governable by pretending that it holds still. It gets better when the people building it tell the truth about how fast it's moving. And today, more of them did. We'll see you tomorrow.